Do we have any more Language of the Heart books around?
We've got one. We need the Language of the Heart.
Your name is John? John? You don't have a Language of the Heart book?
No, I do not.
Huh?
I do not.
Okay.
You want to borrow one?
That would be nice. Thank you.
That's a wonderful book. Probably the second most important book in the literature.
Hey, Rusty.
If you like it, you can even buy it.
That's a deal.
We'll let you test drive it.
Even better.
Our dear Marilyn here is the treasure I was talking about. Marilyn has not completed her first 2 years of sobriety, but she's the best treasure I ever saw, by far, and I've seen hundreds of them. All right, guys, what do you say we get started here? We've got a lot of material to cover tonight. This is our regular Language of the Heart meeting. This is a meeting of the Stairway Group of Alcoholics Anonymous. My name is Jim. I'm an alcoholic.
Jim.
Glad to see everyone here. Start the meeting off with a moment of silent meditation. We'll say the Serenity Prayer together. Thank you. Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. And Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other, and may solve their common problem and help others recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking, and there are no dues or fees for a membership. We are self-supporting to our own contributions. And AA is not allied to any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution. Not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober, help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. And the primary purpose of an Alcoholics Anonymous group is the teaching and practice of the 12 steps. And that is not just my opinion. Many groups say that these days, but many have forgotten it. We find it in the literature, and Bill made quite a point of that. It's customary and traditional in our Stairway group to read a portion of Chapter 5 from the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and Tom's going to do that for us tonight. If you have your Big Book, please open it up to page 58 and follow along.
Tom, alcoholic. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Those who do not recover, people cannot or will not completely get themselves to this simple program. Usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest themselves. They are such unfortunates, they're not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. They are naturally incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. Their chances are less than average. There are those too who suffer from grave emotional mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. Our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we're like now. If you've decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, then you're ready to take certain steps. At some of these we balked. We thought we could find an easier, softer way, but we could not. With an earnestness at our command, we beg you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. Some of us try to hold on to old ideas, and it's always known to let God absolutely. Remember that we deal with alcohol, cunning, baffling, and powerful. God help, it is too much for us, but there is one who has all power, that one is God. May you find him now. Half the majors availed us nothing. We stood at the turning point. We asked for protection and care with complete abandon. Here are the steps we took, which were suggested of the program of recovery. 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that lives had become unmanageable. 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. 4. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7. Humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. 8. Made a list of all persons we had harmed, and became willing to make amends to them all. 9. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10. Continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for the knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Step 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Many of us explain, what an order, I can't go through it. Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We're not saints. The point is that we want to go along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides of progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Our description of the alcoholic, the chapter agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear three pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God could and would if He was sought.
Thank you, Tom. Tom is so slow. I hate to have him read. You know. Thank you, Tom. Tonight our subject that Bill wrote about is willpower. Before we get into the language of the heart, let's take a look at what is the conundrum here. What is the problem with this business of willpower? Take a look on page 42, please, in your big book. The BB, the big book. Page 42. This is part of Fred's story. Fred is the guy who was a CPA who went to Washington on business and ended up getting drunk, not figuring out, couldn't understand why he did it. Let's go 3 lines down from the top. Well, just that did happen and more, for what I had learned of alcoholism did not occur to me at all. I knew from that moment that I had an alcoholic mind. I saw that willpower and self-knowledge would not help in those strange mental blank spots. I had never been able to understand people who said that a problem had them hopelessly defeated. I knew then it was a crushing blow. Let's go over to page 45 now. Top of page, 3 lines down. We could wish to be moral, we could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. It's real important for us to understand this every time we hear somebody say, just don't drink and go to meetings. Well, how the hell do I just not drink? I can't not drink. That's why I'm here. Well, now there's got to be another side to this willpower thing. Let's find out what it is in the big book. Turn to page 85, please. On page 85, the first full paragraph, beginning near the middle of the page. It is easy to let up on the spiritual program of action and rest on our laurels. We're headed for trouble if we do, for alcohol is a subtle foe. We are not cured of alcoholism. What we really have is a daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of our spiritual condition. Every day is a day when we must carry the vision of God's will into all our activities. How can I best serve Thee? Thy will, not mine, be done. These are thoughts which must go with us constantly. Now listen to this now. We can exercise our willpower along this line all we wish. The proper use of our will. So this makes it clear, doesn't it, that the proper use of our will is to will ourselves, turn our will over to God. Sounds like it's kind of a screwy way to put it, and yet that's exactly what it means. So this question of willpower then, Bill decided to address it in an article he wrote for The Grapevine, which we find reproduced on page 272 in Language of the Heart. There's some very interesting stuff in this article, by the way. Aside from the question of willpower, let's see what it has to say. Everybody got that on page 272. There has always been a lot of confusion about this matter of exerting the will. When the 12 steps say we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, we assert what has always been a fact about that malady, namely, that a frontal attack by the will on the desire to drink almost never works.
I didn't have a cake, so I made a pie.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Tommy.
You're welcome.
This hard fact is the premise upon which we must start, the recognition that actual lunacy cannot be subdued by straight willpower. Now, you've often heard me say in our meetings that when we come in the door, we're screwy, we're nuts, we're insane. That's why we have the second step. We need to be restored to sanity. That's why it tells us when we get to the 10th step that just exactly that has happened. Sanity will have returned. Goes on to say, God knows drunks have tried hard enough to do just this and have generally failed. Nobody would expect such a result were every kleptomaniac to take the pledge not to steal. Respecting stealing, the kleptomaniac is as compulsively nutty as he can be. Though this compulsive condition is not so generally recognized in the alcoholic, because drinking is socially acceptable, it is nevertheless true that he's just about as crazy. Therefore, our first step is realistic when it declares that we are powerless to deal with the alcohol hex on our own resources or will. But even AA's first step asks for willingness. The willingness to admit that our willpower is not going to work head on. But that's only a starter. All the rest of AA's 12 steps require both willingness and willpower. You notice that Bill is making a distinction here between willingness and willpower. Willingness connotes a state of mind. Willpower connotes action, actually getting ourselves to do something. They certainly deal in religious and moral values. For example, we must acquire the willingness to take moral inventory. This much accomplished, we must needs muster the gumption to actually do that. We can become willing to believe in the efficacy of A's 12 step, carrying the message to others. But if we are aroused from sleep at 12 o'clock at night to make a 12-step call, well, the actual making of that visit may call for a considerable amount of willpower. For example, it is especially required of the atheist and agnostic that he become open-minded on the subject of God. This seems to require considerable exertion indeed. If then we suggest that he address himself to whatever God there may be in meditation and prayer, usually finds this takes a lot of discipline to do, even as an experiment. The net result of willingness and will, as applied to the life problem in general, does eventuate in a release from the desire to drink, thereby getting around any heavy exertion of willpower on the alcohol problem itself. Now remember, let's take a look at page 85 just for a second in our big book, because this is absolutely apropos to what we're reading right now. The top of page 85, 4 lines down, talking about the new attitude toward liquor and our return to sanity. It just comes. That's a miracle of it. We're not fighting it, neither are we avoiding temptation. We feel as though we've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We have not even sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed. It does not exist for us. And that's what it's telling us here. That it is that willpower is not going to do it, but most certainly God can. We're getting around any heavy exertion of willpower on the alcohol problem itself. Now, whenever I say to you, if I were to say to you, just don't drink and go to meetings, what I'm telling you is utilize your willpower not to drink. What I'm saying is, no matter what happens, no matter what, you don't drink. Well, now, Bill's going to tell us here in a second that that's required, may be required at first. Let's see what he says. Precisely why this release comes to most of us is totally unexplained. We are restored to sanity, provided we condition ourselves for the gift of restoration. What he means there is we have to go to a place of surrender. because until we are surrendered and out of self, there's no way for God to come in. Or to put it in religious terms, to the inflow of God's grace, which results in the expulsion of the obsession. Remember again on page 85 what it tells us, that we've commenced a sense of flow of God's Spirit into us, which is exactly what we were promised back there when we read chapter 4, that we were going to find God deep down within ourselves. It's only there He could be found. Nor does it seem to matter how much we define God's grace. We can still claim, if we like, that we have tapped a hidden or unused inner resource. Now, by the way, that's something that you often hear if you go to free thinkers meetings. They don't want to talk about God, but they will talk about having found their better self, found an inner resource. And when I talk to those folks, I always tell them that's exactly what we say. We find God deep down within ourselves. You say you find inner resource. Maybe, just maybe, it's the same thing. But the result is exactly the same. Or we can believe, as most of us finally do, that we have tapped the resources of God as He exists in us and in the cosmos generally. None of us can presume to know exactly how this is. Last week, I believe it was, we talked about God we've come to understand, God as we understand Him. Didn't we do that last week? And a lot of us were of the opinion that we didn't have understanding of God in the ordinary sense of that word, but that our understanding of God really was based upon our experience of Him working in our lives. Going down to the bottom of page 273, of course, I do not mean to say that no willpower respecting the alcohol problem was ever used. During my first couple of years, I had 2 or 3 severe temptations to drink, but having practiced the AA program pretty faithfully, I was fully able to see the consequences of so doing at the time I was tempted. The usual blinding rationalizations were not present. So that's a real important statement. Notice what Bill's saying here is that the obsession, compulsion to drink was not there. It's just what we read in the big book. If tempted, we recoil from it as from a hot flame. I had been restored to sanity respecting alcohol. I nevertheless had to make a choice. But under these conditions, it was not hard, and the choice did require a certain modicum of willpower, or of willingness to choose rightly, which is another way of saying the same thing. I think this exercise of the will is appropriate and necessary during the interval in which one is developing a general release from the problem. And we've often said that around here, and in our sponsorship workshop we certainly take this position, that at the very beginning it's necessary that we help the newcomer exercise whatever degree of willpower they have in order to get through those first few days or weeks until the steps can take over. But a general and complete release is quite possible after considerable practice of AA's program. And of course that's true, and that's what the big book says, that the problem's going to be solved. I know because I have been under enormous emotional strain since AA started. I had a neurotic depression that lasted from 1943 through 1955, one from which I never fully surfaced. About 3 years of this was suicidal. Now, I've often commented on this to people when we're talking about the 12 and 12. You will notice that this is during the time when Bill was writing the 12 and 12. He was highly depressed and suicidal as part of that time, and he was also experimenting with LSD, and he was flirting around with the Catholic Church. Besides which, he was under the thumb of Father Ed Dowling, who was a Catholic Jesuit priest in St. Louis, not a member of the fellowship. So there are a lot of discrepancies between the 12 and 12 and the Big Book. And my personal opinion is that those discrepancies can be well understood when we understand that when Bill wrote that thing, he was a sick man. It wasn't until after he had been willing to give up his leadership role in the fellowship that he began to recover. And he talks about that in another article, which we will get into here one of these days, called Toward Emotional Sobriety, in which he details for us what happens when we allow ourselves to become so dependent upon people, places, or things. That's what had happened with him. He was totally dependent upon his place and his authority and his guruship in AA. And he got worse and worse and worse. When he finally gave up his leadership role and let others take over, that's when he began to recover. Most of these articles that we're going to be reading are written after that happened, and they're quite different from what he wrote in the 12 and 12. Just for one example, he wrote an article on humility, which is in this book, where it went on for 7 pages about humility, never once mentioned the 7th step. So you have to wonder, why is it that 12 and 12 spends a whole 7-step discussion centered on humility? Because it just simply was not appropriate. It was something that Father Ed foisted off on him, and he took it up and ran with it. Release from alcohol had been so thorough that I was never tempted during this long siege to resort to drink. So this is the substance of the AA party line as I happen to see it. But please be assured you don't necessarily have to see it the same way. Plenty of people differ with me and yet remain sober. Nevertheless, the experience of most of us seems to back up what I've just said. Those who try to work the program in other ways and who succeed by so doing are, in my belief, staying dry the hard way, which is another way of saying untreated alcoholism. A's orthodoxy, if it can be called that, is merely what the majority experience suggests. You can still take your pick. That's a pretty neat article, isn't it? It really gets down to the nitty-gritty about this business of willpower. Now it's time for us to share with each other our experience on this, or any questions we have, or what have you. Who'd like to start? Subject is willpower, the use of willpower. What's the appropriate use? Yes, Jean?
In the article, when you commented about using your willpower in the beginning because you don't know how to work the program now, that's what I found to be very true.
Yeah. Right, and Bill makes no bones about it. He's saying, isn't he, that willpower is not going to keep us sober, but that at first it may be necessary. And for example, a lot of people will say around the rooms things like, if you can't remember your last drink, you haven't had it, and we've got to keep it green, and all that stuff. Well, that's simply pandering to fear of the consequences of the next drunk. We know for a fact from reading the big book that fear doesn't keep us sober. On the other hand, it can be very valuable in those first few days or weeks. Many of us cannot remember our last drunk because we were in a blackout when it happened. But that's really not what it means. What it's really talking about is to remember what happened as a result of getting drunk, trying to keep that in mind as an incentive to continue to do what we're being told to do when we come in. This does not militate, however, against the first step, the things that we must do for a first step. We've got to read the big book. Take a look at chapter 7. You'll see that right off the bat, we give them the book and ask them to read it. We've got to get to meetings. We've got to talk to people who are in recovery. And we've got to start praying, even if we're praying to whom it may concern, or God, if you're there. And if we do those 4 things, the first step will come to us as a gift. And while we're doing that, we can remember what we learned from the third pertinent idea. That's one of the great promises in the big book. That we're alcoholic, can't manage our own lives. No human power is going to relieve us of our alcoholism. God can and will if we do what? If we seek Him. So the sooner we can get a newcomer beginning the process of seeking God, the sooner we can feel assured that God is in his life and will be helping him with his obsession and compulsion to drink. But this does not say that the person who's brand new isn't going to have to use some modicum of willpower in the first few days or weeks. Anybody else like to comment on that particular point? Yes, Ivan.
Always consider that God does answer foxhole prayers. Like, God give me one more day of sobriety. And I think that works for a period of time based on the person's willingness to get into the program. If they don't get into the program pretty fast, that pretty much goes out the window. But God does answer foxhole prayers as far as I'm concerned.
No doubt about that. Please just keep me sober for a day, yes, sir.
One day.
Is there something else, Ivan?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
Good.
My name is Janelle, I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Janelle.
Just before I say something about willpower, I just thought it was interesting that, you said he didn't pick up or, drink during the time that he was in this suicidal depression or something like that, but yet he was using LSD, and, today it's a different world, and you have so many people that come into AA, and maybe they don't find that they have a problem with alcohol, but they're using something else, and I know that was true for me, but I was probably a blackout drinker like at 16.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went on to other things, I wasn't drinking, so it was hard for me to do that. I just think that, there's such an issue between, the different fellowships and what's going on, that really it's not, because one of our founders, he didn't drink, but he wasn't, spiritually fit at all.
Yeah, that LSD was not a controlled substance at that time, so he wasn't breaking the law, but he was trying to heighten spiritual experience, which I think probably was the Timothy Leary or whatever that guy's name is. Isn't that what he was advocating? Also, you're dead right about the drug part of it. Open your big books up to page 24. I'm sorry, 22. Second line, if he can afford it, he may have liquor concealed all over his house to be certain no one gets his entire supply away from him to throw down the waste pipe. As matters grow worse, he begins to use a combination of high-powered sedative and liquor to quiet his nerves so he can go to work. Then comes a day when he simply cannot make it and gets drunk all over again. Perhaps he goes to a doctor who gives him morphine or some sedative with which to taper off. Then he begins to appear at hospitals and sanitariums. And if you want to see read a story that goes into great detail on this, just read Dr. Addict Alcoholic in the back of the book. Starts on page 439. So, it is a problem. It is a problem, but I think we make too much of it. If I may editorialize, if we can understand and believe and accept the fact that the 12 steps work for everybody, then what do we care? It may well be that the only difference between an addict and an alcoholic in terms of recovery is if an alcoholic has never been addicted to drugs, may not be able to properly identify with the addict so the addict can be helped with his first step. Well, let's assume we have an addict who has worked his first step. Every other step is exactly the same. We stopped talking about addiction and alcoholism right from the very beginning. There isn't a word in the big book in the first 164 pages about don't drink. Not one word. Dr. Silkworth says that we can never safely drink alcohol again for the rest of our lives, but the solution to the alcoholism problem is not don't drink, it's find God. It's that simple, yes.
So what's the story you said that would go with that, 401?
439.
439.
Mm-hmm. So, we have to be real careful about this. Alcohol is but a symptom of our illness. Our illness is spiritual bankruptcy. And of course there is a mental and a physical aspect of this as well. But the big book further tells us that when the spiritual malady is overcome, we will straighten out mentally and physically. So the real key here is to straighten out the spiritual malady. We come in here in a state of rebellion and defiance and denial. And we're going to have to get past all of that and get to a place of surrender. And the way we do that is to work the steps. And there isn't a particle difference between alcoholics and addicts when it comes to that requirement. And the 12 steps work just as well for anybody because they're universal principles. We don't have any monopoly on them. They weren't given only to alcoholics to work only for alcoholics. That's obvious. There are probably 50 different 12-step groups out there now with people recovering from all kinds of different human ailments. Okay, who's next? Paul, you look expectant. What do you got in your mind?
Well, I was just thinking about just discipline and willpower that it takes to, I guess really the beginning is, I guess from the very beginning, it's going to take the willpower to, if you're suggested to read the book, go to meetings, talk to people in recovery, and pray, especially for, like Bill said, for the agnostic or atheist to pray and meditate. You're going to take some sort of willpower to will yourself to do that. And I found for myself that doing the 4th step, because of the amount of work involved, and doing the 9th step, and I don't know if it was willpower. Maybe it was a lot of willpower, but I think most of it was praying. When I got to a situation where I didn't want to make a certain amends, it was praying for the willingness, and the willpower came. It was a direct result of getting the power from God. I know that it came from the God within. It didn't come from me because I didn't want to do it. But the same thing with the 10th step. I have to really be careful to try to keep, I don't have it with me right now, that little notebook in my pocket, and I've got about 10 of them, or 5 of them, and I try to keep one in my car, and one at work, and one at the house, but I hardly ever am able to keep one in my pocket, and I need to start praying for something to keep that in my pocket.
You got to wear a shirt with pockets.
Yeah. And the 11th step, I haven't had any problem with that, doing it before I go to bed, but, and that hasn't really taken the willpower. But I can see how, if I'm really tired sometime, I might have to force myself.
What's the big book say about people like you? It says, we alcoholics are very undisciplined people. And we have to let God discipline us in the way we've just outlined. Right? So that's what we do. Thanks for sharing that, Paul. At first, what you found out is this hasn't become a habit yet. So at first you have to exercise your willpower to make yourself do these things. And as one great man said, true freedom comes when we do the things we ought to do because we want to do them. And we get to that point after a while because the results are universally excellent. And after a while you wouldn't be without your inventory and your prayer and your meditation and your meetings and working with others because the results are so wonderful and the way of life is so great. And why would you want to ever back away from something that really works? And the only problem, of course, is the resurgence of self. That's why every day as we go through day and we take our 10-step inventory, we watch for that self to come flooding back in. And it will do it. Selfishness, self-centeredness, self-pity. We watch for it. And when it happens, we write about it and talk about it and ask God to take it away. Because we are powerless over it. Our natural self wants, our natural self begs to be self-centered. That's the way we seem to be made that way. And when information comes to us, we take it in and we sort it out to see if it's bad for us or good for us, or if we can safely ignore it. And it goes no further. And that seems to be the way we're built. So staying in a state of surrender is something that requires work every day. And one of the things that we just read a few minutes ago, as we go through the day, we say over and over again, what do you want me to do next, God? Thy will, not mine, be done. The proper use of my will is to will myself, turn my will over to God. That's the way it works. Thanks, Paul. John, would you like to share with us tonight?
My name's Donald, by the way.
Hey,
Donald. I've been listening to what you've been saying. But I think the hard part is actually the first introduction when you go to any meeting. Nobody goes into depth or tries to explain what you're talking about now, what we're all sharing now with some intelligence. Because what they do, I tend to believe from going to the meetings in the beginning, where they use all their cliches as a point of recovery. In that world and everything else, instead of saying that they're danger signs or they're triggers too, they use it as a strength to recover. And because I know I could have drank if I was hungry or if I wasn't hungry. That didn't matter, If I was mad, I drank just as good as when I was happy. But the way it's introduced in a generality, when you go to certain meetings, when you're first being introduced to the program, the emphasis is not learning the book, but learning why you want to get sober. Not learning that there's a better way, not learning that the true meaning is to find a belief that there is something helping us. You go out there and you listen, and I could go to meetings sometimes, and I hear, when they share, you hear anger. A man tells you, I got 10 years experience, but I only beat my wife once a week now. Yeah. I don't do it 3 times a week anymore. Well, that's good. He's got sobriety. He's got recovery in him. I don't understand that. And that is why I go to so many meetings. I come to this one, I go to other ones, where I try and educate myself. But the guy that just goes to that meeting and listens to the same story believes that that is the foundation of AA. From what he's hearing from that one particular meeting. He doesn't diversify, try and get out and learn a little bit more. I don't think what they're doing. I'm a terrible reader, so that's why I like when people read and I get a good understanding and I can listen. But that's the hardship to it. When I first came in, I didn't. I don't even know how that's far in. But like I said, I tried it. Matter of fact, I'll bring out a perfect example. I once tried to project whatever we discussed at our meeting here at another meeting. I was told I was classified the minority, not the majority.
You was what?
I was a minority in my thinking. I wasn't part of the majority of the thinking. Carrying anything I heard, which I thought made sense, dealing with the program, carried almost verbatim, the same identical words at another meeting, put it out, and I was classified as a minority thinker. I wasn't part of the majority way of thinking. Times have changed. Don't be so critical. You have to give leeway. You have to be loose in hands. Don't tell a person you shouldn't drink. Try and cut back. This is the picture that's out there for some of the new people that are coming around. And I sit down and I listen to it. I have to just sit there and listen.
Well, I suppose that there are groups where the majority opinion would be directly opposite of what we're talking about here. But you can go to other parts of the country and you'll find that people who do not hold with the big book have a very, very tough time. Because the fact is very simple. The 12 steps as written work. Nothing else has ever been shown to work. if you pick up the big book and read it, you don't have to worry about any of this other stuff. And you'll find that there are no weasel words. There's no equivocation. It comes right up, flat out, and tells us exactly what needs to be done if, this is the big question, if we want to follow their path. Again, the big book is not philosophy. It's not opinion. It's experience. What it recites is the experience of those who wrote it. They're saying very simply this: this is the way we got sober. This is what we did to recover from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, and we believe that if you will do so too, you will likewise recover. That's why we wrote this book, to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this volume. And it sticks to that all the way through. That's the premise of this book. So if you accept that, and then if you decide that you want what we have, and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, then, right then, not a year from now, but right then, you're ready to take certain steps. Because you've decided you want what you see in the people who have recovered, and now if you're willing to go to any lengths to get it, then work the steps. There's no equivocation there either. And you don't find anything in this big book that says something like, oh golly gee whiz, it would be kind of nice if you sort of did this. Everything in this book is categorical imperative. It's absolutes. Why? It's not because they're saying that this is absolutely true. It's saying this is absolutely what we did. And so we're telling you exactly what we did. And we're also telling you that it is our very strong opinion that if you do what we did, you too will recover. And it turns out they were right. When this book was first written in 1939, you say, where do these guys get off with all this stuff? Millions of recoveries later can't say that. The proof is in the pudding. The steps work. Right? I wouldn't worry about those kinds of folks. You just have to pray for them because they got a problem. They have a serious problem.
The problem is they're touching a lot of fresh blood. A lot of young people that are coming in.
That's why whenever you go to a meeting, if you believe in what the big book says, you share from the book. And here's the rule. If it's not in the book and God's not in the equation, forget it. It ain't going to work. And so when we share from the book, we cannot be wrong. We're saying this is what the book says. And that's what it does say. And this is what I do. I follow the direction in this book. And I have recovered. And I believe that if you do it, you will too. That's what they're telling us in the book. That's what we can tell others. The people who do not want to put in the effort or who are afraid of facing themselves and being honest with themselves aren't going to hear it anyway. We're going to be waving bye-bye to them sooner or later. Thank you, Dom. Who's next? Rusty.
Rusty, alcoholic. I can relate to that so much. I had to write off my home group because of that. When I first got there, all I would hear was just don't drink codeines, keep it green, blah, 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 and that's all I did. And I found that worked for about 6 weeks. Every morning when I got up, I'd look in the mirror and I could picture myself how I looked before I went into detox. 30 pounds underweight, bones sticking out. And that worked good for a while. But it didn't work. I had to go do a little experiment. And when I came back, I finally got a sponsor and started listening to what he said. He didn't have a whole lot to say, but he helped me out quite a bit. And I would hear all these things in the room and I would get so frustrated that it was driving me nuts because I'd go to different meetings all over town and I knew what they were saying wasn't by the book or this, that, and the other. And I was just going completely crazy. One thing that used to get me was to hear somebody for 10 years say, well, you need to prepare for the bad times because they're coming, blah, blah, blah. You sit there and somebody for 10 years is telling a newcomer that, there could be bad times. I don't care what you do, you're going to have bad times. And after I've been sober for over 2 years, I asked my sponsor, I said, when are the bad times coming? And he said, when you want them to. And that's what I realized. when I want them to come, they'll come, but as long as I don't want to, they'll do what's in the book.
You remember what Abraham Lincoln said about that? He said, I reckon a man is about as happy as he wants to be.
And, you know, so I found out that I just had to accept that that's the way that it's going to be, you know, and I try not to let it frustrate me. And when it does, I have to get up and leave a meeting, you know, and that's just the way I have to deal with it.
Yeah, when I was 2 years old, they told me the third year is the hardest. When I was 5 years sober, they told me the sixth year is the hardest. This kept on all the way up to about 20. Nobody tells me that anymore.
And I still get back to my home group. I went there last night, you know, but I go there maybe once a month now, and everybody corners me up. Where have you been? What have you been doing? Why don't you come here anymore? And I have to flat out tell them, you know, I have to go where recovery's at. And they look at me like, what do you mean where it's at?
Yeah.
Then you try to explain it to them, and they get all bent out of shape. So I look out for me, because if I don't look out for me, I can't look out for anybody else.
Yeah, you're far better off to keep your own counsel. You share when you have a chance, share from the big book, and share the truth. And you see, all the meetings of this group, Stairway Group, are based on one thing. That in this group we talk about the big book, God, and recovery. And the people who want to hear that show up, and the people who don't. And it's turned out that there are a whole bunch of people who want to hear that message. So that's why we have 3 meetings when we start out with only one. We just keep right on doing it.
One night in a meeting, I said, you know, as far as my experience, and that's all I can tell you, is if it's not in the big book or God doesn't have anything to do with it, then you might as well be dissing in the wind.
That's right.
That's my experience.
Yeah.
And then they want to run you out of town with a shotgun, so I left.
Well, these are the same people who made up the whole idea of a pink cloud because they don't like to see people happy.
That's all I got to share.
Okay. Anybody have an irresistible impulse? Otherwise known as a burning desire? All right, next week, same time, same station, we'll have another delicious article to look at. Let's close the meeting. Oh, wait a minute, you can't leave yet. We got to pay the rent. Holy cow.
I forgot.
Marilyn will.
Do that after you all sit.
It's such a good treasure, I figured there's something. We can try to round up the money.
And every time I forget that, Marilyn just gives me all kinds of hell. Pay before you. You got to pay to pray.
That's a good slogan.
Let this circle represent the unity of our fellowship. A moment of silence for those who are still suffering. And we'll say the Lord's Prayer together. Again, please remember in our group we don't say anything after we say amen. Thank you. Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you all for being here. Please come back. See you next week. God willing, the creek goes dry.